Welcome to the Disability Partnership Calderdale podcast. This week, our guest is Calderdale historian David Glover. David is a very well-known figure in the area and hosts numerous historical talks, presentations and walks across the area every year. David will be joining us at our next open meeting on Tuesday the 22nd of April 2025 at the King's Centre in Halifax. In this podcast, David chats to myself, Philip Ingham, and my colleague Nicki Slingsby about local history, and he gives us a taste of the special presentation he'll be making at our meeting.
Yeah.
I suppose what one question I'd like to ask you, David, is you moved to the Halifax area in the 1980s. And obviously you've become a leading figure in local history studies.
Leading figure, perhaps.
It always, I mean, as a Calderdale resident all my life, it seems a fascinating place and the history is very diverse. Why is the history so dense in Calderdale? Does every corner of every street seem to have its own story? Is that just because we're local and we look into it, or is Calderdale a particularly interesting area, do you think?
It's hard to be sure. You could look at that two ways. You could say that every town, every area has its own history and stories to tell. We appreciate it because of where we are. There's no doubt about that. I mean, I haven't ventured much outside Calderdale in discussing local history, although I do give talks about other historical subjects even around the country. But locally, Halifax has been described to me by people who've lived here all their life, rather older than us, if I may say so, who say Halifax has always been very parochial, and it used to be much more so. Very self-contained. Lots of people knew each other. It's not to say absolutely everybody did. A lot of interconnection between groups and families and such like. And this created an entity or a community which was very specifically very close, and an environment was created which was Halifax, or if you like Calderdale, particularly Halifax. It's hard to be quite sure whether this arose in a way that's different to Huddersfield perhaps, or one of the smaller towns like Elland or Ripondon. Excuse me. I think there are similar ideas elsewhere, so I don't think we could say it's unique.
Do you think the geography of Calderdale, it helps that?
Yes.
You do have these barriers of hills and valleys that naturally define communities, but also naturally split the communities apart. I mean, Halifax is a very possibly as large. It's as large a town as you get, where it's potential you can have that community. Any bigger than that, and you're starting to get into a rambling city, aren't you? But Calderdale's full of these little entities. Yes. I mean, I'm from Tomberton, and Halifax seemed to me to be another world when I was growing up, and now as an adult, there's continuity. So it's a very Calderdale thing to have little isolated, well, not isolated, but distinct communities divided by hills and valleys. I mean, we're doing this podcast in the Wheatley Valley, aren't we? Which again has its own very distinct characteristics. It's a fascinating area. What do you have a start and finish period that you cover? Does your history interest start at a certain point and finish at another point, or are you happy to move about?
Yes, I do vary. I don't dwell on recent history particularly, but in some of the slideshows I give of old Halifax or wherever around Calderdale, they can be, right up to the 1990s if you want to show something that's nostalgic to people who might remember more recently, and particularly perhaps if a site has changed or a building has changed or been demolished, and point it out and say, that was there till 1991. What's there now? Or it's gone completely. Other people are much more interested in very much early. There's illustrations we can use of Halifax going back, well into the 19th century and very occasionally earlier. But generally history is something that I just take and run with wherever it comes. I don't really deal with prehistory, if that's of any interest, nor the Saxons, who didn't have much influence in this area. The Vikings may have had a little, but I don't really talk about them either.
I guess that's a very Calderdale thing as well, is that the vast amount of the population and the buildings and communities we know are Industrial Revolution and post-Industrial Revolution.
But Halifax, of course, did develop as a very close woolen industry entity in early times, and the fact that it was cut off in many ways from the outside world, a lot of people really were self-contained here, not just in Halifax, the Calder Valley too. A lot of people just didn't venture anywhere, and they didn't make a lot in going up to London. There were exceptions. We had a chap in the reign of Elizabeth I who came from this area and eventually came to be Lord Mayor in 1598, Lord Mayor of London. So people did escape and achieve things like that. But the fact it wasn't easy to access. We're in the middle of the north of England, as we all know, halfway between Leeds and Manchester, probably not exactly halfway, but not exactly on a hugely direct route to London or a major city otherwise. The way in which the wool and textile industry was developing, even in the 1400s or 1500s, it was very, very insular. It was separate. And then you get the Act of Parliament in 1555, which granted certain rights to Halifax, which is unique, so that it didn't have to take account of various guilds and things like were governing people in York who were in a similar type of environment, a similar type of employment. Halifax has a good number of unique factors, and I'm just admiring your squirrel climbing up the tree there.
I know.
Yes, I love watching them. I know some people say they're rodents with fancy tails.
If you visited our trustee Marion, if we was at Grove Court, they are so tame now. They come onto a windowsill, they come and they check the nuts, or they take them off around. I've known them come in and shake the walnuts to get the best one and then go back out again.
They're quite selective. Marion's developed a good relationship with them, and they're picky. Yeah. Now they've established
number 23. She buys me really nice nuts. Let's go to her.
But let's not be hasty. Let's pick the best of them.
Oh yes,
That's most extraordinary.
Yeah. Like you say, a lot of people say no, don't go near them. They're vermin, but they just sit there and look at him. What can we have?
Yeah, we used to get taken out. I mean, I grew up in northwest London, which was pretty. It was town, wasn't it? It was a townscape. The parks were not brilliant. We went a bit further afield, you'd be taken to places where there were wild animals and squirrels and that. And I remember beginning to learn to feed a tame squirrel out of my hand. On one occasion I got bitten.
Oh no, they are, they are.
Yeah, there's still a wild animal.
Sorry, we're going off track all the time.
Okay, so back to history. Another I mean, we're throwing these rather random history questions at you. Calderdale is really on the map at the moment because of Anne Lister and the coiners stories, those two separate stories, which have really come to prominence. Why have they risen into prominence in the last few years? And is there another story that Calderdale has that maybe is the next one of those? Because it's really interesting how they've put us on the map, haven't they?
Definitely.
Well, the coiner's story, it was well known in the locality, but probably not much written down until the 19th century, nearly a century after the actual doings. The first lectures were held in the 1880s to talk about the coiners, and that was published in the local newspaper. And it went from there. There were publications early in the 20th century, which brought a little bit more information, although it was pretty dull and just reprinting of old documents, so not particularly well written.
Were they commercial documents, as in they were sold to be read for entertainment purposes, or were they history documents, or?
They would have been documents connected with the legal aspects of the coiners in the 1760s and 1770s, plus a number of handbills and so on, which would describe various people who were wanted, sometimes in a bit of detail. You know, it tells what colour hair they had, whether they wore a wig, as some of them did in those days. Sometimes you get one with a spotty face, and the description of their clothes. So it's quite fun, that. So this information was quite esoteric, perhaps, bits and pieces from here and there, assembled by one of the early curators at Bankfield Museum, Ling Roth, and he published this book about 120 years ago. The story of the coiners, I think, really captured the modern imagination, particularly from the time the book called Clip a Bright Guinea by John Marsh, who was a local novelist, wrote a number of novels, and that book itself is written a little bit in the style of a novel, and we don't know where he got some of his information, so it was a little bit fantastic, I don't know. But it's a wonderful read, and that was in the 1970s. That really awoke a lot more interest in the story. Earlier in the century, some moulds and things connected with the coiners were rediscovered in Hampton Bridge, which weren't known about till then, so that in that era must have created a bit more interest. And then more and more books have been published, and of course we've had this two-part television series. Was it a three-part television series? I think it was. Based on a wonderful book. However, the book was good. It was a novel. Ben, who wrote it, has a good grasp of his subject, but when they handed it over for television, I'm not sure I was very happy with it. And it took ages to bring it to our screens. I know a few people who were involved with the filming, and what I heard sounded quite interesting, but when I came to watch the TV series, and a lot of people agree with me when I've discussed it, it doesn't seem to be quite the same thing, and I wouldn't recommend it. But I would recommend the novel, and I would read out to anybody about the coiners or talk about them to anybody. It's just an exciting story. It's a very insular story, something that took place away from much of the build-up and commercial settlements around, particularly local to Calderdale, and particularly a fairly local section of. And the landscape influenced that, the fact that these men were able to work. They were able to work far, far away from Halifax.
Still a fairly isolated spot today, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. If you go up to like Bell House, where excuse me, go up to Bell House, where the king of the coiners lived back in the 1760s, it is remote. It's hard to get to. It's still devoid of trees, so you can still see around. One of the issues was keeping watch, so that you weren't caught with your equipment or actually clipping coins. So you'd have to find somewhere to stash it. Not quite a moment's notice, because you'd have somebody looking out. And it was ideal, because they had several farmsteads on that hillside who were operating like that, and elsewhere. But how wide it was, we get all sorts of misconceptions, like particularly in the TV series, it was said, this clipping and coining, it was creating problems for the whole country, which is absolute nonsense. It did affect the merchants of Halifax and maybe one or two towns nearby, but
this wasn't a widespread practice across the country then? This was a real hot spot of it, even if it wasn't unique? It
was a hot spot in the late 1760s, but there were other examples of similar enterprise over many centuries. We even have one or two in Calderdale that go back much further, usually involving some kind of forging silver, shillings and things. However, that was not sort of on a grand scale.
No.
In a locality. It was more one or two men doing a little bit.
So the coiners were almost semi-industrial in their scale. Yes. And therefore had a potential to have an impact, and therefore much more serious crime. The third part of my question, I threw three questions at it, which is really bad technique.
Okay.
we've also got the Anne Lister stories that obviously risen for a number of reasons, and he's has a really big impact on Calderdale now and our tourism. Is there another Anne Lister or Coiner story that's just waiting to break in Calderdale? And what would is there anything that particularly catches your eye that has those sort of has those tick boxes of slight amount of sensation and something quite different that Calderdale's got, or do you think we've is it hard as a historian? Is it hard to actually predict what will take off as a story as well?
I think so. I mean, if I just take as an example topics that I've chosen to make a presentation, some of them have taken off astronomically. I'm being a bit excessive in my description there, but some of them have proved remarkably popular. Others are very mundane and they're just there, and sometimes people ask for them. I think you'd have to say we can never predict the future. With Anne Lister, the story was always there. It started, of course, with her back in the early 19th century. But the transcripts that were made in the 1960s, I don't know how widely people know this, the transcripts of her diaries by two local women who are fairly well known. One was based in London, but they were both originally from Halifax, and they're both academics, intelligent. They did research in the 1960s into Anne Lister's diaries, either cracked the code, about the code in which the more secret parts are kept, were kept. Therefore, they wanted to publish, and they could not get permission to publish. So that was a stymieing of something which became very important 20 years later. Helena Whitbread, 1988, with her first volume. But even then, what did that tell us? It told us the story of a lady in a remote part of England. The book was published not in great numbers by a not very well-known press, and the story didn't get all that well known. Even then, Helena published another book in the early 1990s, and then in 1998, Jill Liddington came along publishing a later period in history of Anne Lister. Helena's was mainly the early life of Anne Lister, when she was growing up, getting to know people, travelling about a bit. But Jill Liddington's focus was very much on her as the manager of an estate, how she developed a relationship with Anne Walker and became a coal mining entrepreneur, things like that. And travelled very far, climbing the Pyrenees, including one particular mountain, which as far as we know had never been climbed before by a man or woman. So she was a remarkable woman. But even that, when I started helping with welcoming at Halifax Minster, which would be 20 odd years ago, sometimes I show people round and so on. So the number of people who came in and asked about Anne Lister after her tombstone had been rediscovered, which came to light again in 2000, that was discovered under some pews in pieces. The number of people who came in and asked about that were absolutely minimal 20 years ago, and probably right up to 2019 when we had Sally Wainwright creating Gentleman Jack, the first series. And after that, I don't know, we say the floodgates open, but certainly the topic
completely changed.
So if I just lead on from that to say, what is going to be the next Anne Lister, what is going to be the next Coiners, it is not absolutely clear. There are things lurking in the background, but you can never prejudge, can you, with certainty. If I think of anything, I'll let you know, and I'll let you run with it so that you can promote it so it becomes big.
Let's turn back to you. You're visiting us at our open meeting in April. Tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about at that meeting.
Yes, well, at your open meeting in April, I've been invited to talk about Halifax Zoo. I don't know how many people will be aware that Halifax once had a zoo. It's a long, long time ago, and if you remembered it, you'd probably have to be about 120 now. So I don't think any of our hearers when I come along, and certainly I'm not quite that old, although I sometimes think I live in the 19th century or before, I shall be talking about a development which was new in 1909, when a plan was made to create a zoo between Siddle and Exley, up on a little plateau of land, focused around what had been a small mansion really built for one of the mayors of Halifax, which had been a hotel, and then some men wanted to turn it into a zoo. But it was not just a zoo, it was an entertainment place. So when I'm talking, I shall speak about animals, various adventures, including an elephant that got out of control, and also a meandering bear which ran away and disappeared into Elland Wood. But along with that, there are lots of other little anecdotes about sideshows and performances. So we have Black Dyke Band performing, we have military bands performing, and military people doing various sorts of exhibitions and such like, Pierrots. Also, we have to remember that there was this wonderful little railway train that ran around on a small track. It was a miniature railway train with passenger carriages, I suppose you call them, open carriages behind, which ran around a part of the site. So a lot of things ongoing, and there was even like a cinema there, which was I think was the very first cinema in the Halifax area. The building it stood in was actually really a wooden construction, so it wasn't very substantial. Along with that, you have anecdotes about events involving people who visited there and such like. However, there's one aspect which is probably less known, that some early parts of Halifax's aeronautical history took place there. A number of balloons were exhibited there, and they would have been brought along on carts, or perhaps by train and then on cart, and they would be inflated on site. These were hot air balloons of the early variety, just at the time when aeroplanes were beginning to develop. Alongside that, there were a lot of hot air balloons being exhibited by a chap called Spencer from North London, and there are accounts of what happened to some of these balloons. And the third, I think it was the third balloon that came along, was much larger. It was like a small airship. And the adventures that happened to some of these when they were blown off course are quite entertaining. So from lions and elephants and through to adventures in the air, there's quite a lot of interest to hear, and some quite funny tales.
Fantastic. Well, that it sounds absolutely wonderful. Thanks for your time today, David. We're all very much looking forward to seeing you in April and hearing your stories. And thanks again. Thanks for coming along.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So David Glover will be joining us for our next open meeting on Tuesday, 22nd of April 2025. The meeting runs from 12 noon till 3 p.m. The venue is the King's Centre, Park Road, Halifax, HX1 2TS. It's a friendly, sociable get-together. You don't need to book. It's free to attend, and there is a free buffet. So just to remind you again, it's the Disability Partnership Calderdale open meeting, 12 till 3 on Tuesday the 22nd of April 2025 at the King's Centre, Park Road, Halifax.